Welcome to the deep dive. So imagine for a second that you're looking down at a sprawling, just massive city.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And over this city sits a regime that is actively being targeted, like physically bombed by foreign powers. Logic tells you their eyes would be glued to the sky, right? Watching for the next airstrike, bracing for impact.
Right, yeah. You'd think they'd be entirely focused on the external threat.
Exactly. But instead, their ultimate fear, the thing that actually keeps the leadership awake at night, isn't the foreign bombs falling from above. It's the people walking on the streets below.
Which, I mean, that completely inverts the standard political science model of how a nation at war usually behaves.
Yeah, how so?
Well, typically you expect this rally round the flag effect, where a government and its citizens form a sort of temporary truce to face the outside enemy.
Oh, sure, like putting aside differences for the greater good.
Right. But in this scenario, the external threat is actually secondary to the internal one.
And the regime we're talking about today, the Iranian regime, they aren't operating like a traditional government at all. To really grasp what's happening on the ground, you have to picture an octopus.
An octopus. Okay, that's a vivid image.
Right, a massive, deeply entrenched octopus that has wrapped its tentacles around, like every single facet of daily civilian life. Fearing its own citizens more than any foreign military is just the baseline of this really jarring reality we're exploring today.
And we have a highly detailed, deeply passionate piece of source material to guide us through this landscape, don't we?
We do. We're pulling from a broadcast by Radio Irava. It features this really granular, intense interview with two prominent Iranian activists.
Yeah, we're listening to Ms. Gissoo Shakeri, who is a singer and human rights activist, and Mr. Amir Karegar, a poet and activist.
And I just want to say, the way they break down the situation on the ground, it's an absolute masterclass in the anatomy of a grassroots struggle.
It really is. But just a quick framework note for you listening before we get into the mechanics of their arguments.
Yeah, good call. We need to set the ground rules.
Right, because this broadcast contains highly charged political viewpoints. Ms. Shakeri and Mr. Karegar offer blistering critiques, not just of the current Iranian regime, but also of other prominent opposition figures.
Specifically Reza Pahlavi, right?
Exactly. And because of the intense nature of this political landscape, we are acting purely as neutral analytical guides today. We are not taking sides or endorsing viewpoints or validating these specific criticisms.
Yeah, our goal is strictly to explore the architecture of their arguments, so you can understand the nuances of this geopolitical struggle exactly as these activists see it.
Precisely. We're mapping out their worldview because understanding how they perceive the battlefield is really the only way to understand the conflict itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the resistance they're fighting for, we first have to understand what they are actually up against.
Right.
And Ms. Shakeri's analysis of the regime is striking because she completely rejects the idea that Iran is run by a standard government.
Yeah, she argues that looking for traditional state apparatuses like, a standard civil bureaucracy, it actually blinds you to how power functions there.
Which brings us back to that octopus metaphor.
Exactly. She describes the regime as this eight-legged monster with vacuum suckers attached to the most granular levels of society.
And she gets incredibly specific about how those vacuum suckers operate logistically, too. She labels the system a mosque-centric mafia.
A mosque-centric mafia, which is such a harsh juxtaposition, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, typically a mosque is a spiritual center, a place of community worship. But Shakeri details a system where these mosques, along with centers affiliated with the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they function as logistical hoarding hubs.
Hoarding hubs, like for what?
Well, she describes massive industrial freezers packed with nylon-wrapped meat and huge warehouses of rice, all controlled by the local clerics.
Wow. And you have to view that hoarding in the context of the broader economy, because the general population is enduring crushing inflation, unemployment, just systemic poverty.
Right. She points out that while everyday people literally have nothing to eat, the regime is sitting on these stockpiles of basic necessities.
And it isn't just a broken supply chain, is it?
No, not at all. It's a deliberate mechanism of control. They use food strategically to buy compliance.
So if a family is starving,
the local mosque-centric network distributes that food, but only to those who demonstrate ideological loyalty or attend regime-sanctioned events.
That is, it's a system that directly ties a citizen's physical survival to their political obedience.
Which is the defining characteristic of a mafia state. You monopolize the essential resources and use them as leverage.
But the companion to that economic leverage is sheer, uncompromising physical force. The sources note that even while the regime is absorbing the impact of foreign bombings from the U.S. and Israel, their domestic suppression machine hasn't slowed down at all.
If anything, they actively project power internally through executions. Shakeri emphasizes that the regime uses the executions of political prisoners not just as punishment, but as a broadcast mechanism.
To terrorize the streets.
Exactly. They want the public to see the lethal cost of defiance. But, stepping back, I find the mechanics of this a bit confusing.
How so?
Well, if a country's infrastructure is actively being bombed by a foreign power, you'd assume the regime would weaken internally. That the chaos of war would stretch their security forces too thin and give the public a massive opening to rise up.
Yeah, that's a logical assumption. But what's fascinating here is that Shakeri assumes the regime relies on a centralized point of failure.
Okay, meaning what?
Think of a traditional power grid, right? If an airstrike takes out the central plant, the entire city goes dark and the government loses control. But Shakeri is describing a highly decentralized enforcement network.
Oh, I see. Sort of like the architecture of the internet. If one server goes down, the data just routes around it. The system survives the localized damage.
Exactly. The power and the weapons are distributed among thousands of smaller, local commanders, neighborhood mosques, and regional IRGC branches.
So dropping a bomb on a national military facility might damage their conventional warfare capabilities, but it doesn't dismantle the local suppression networks.
Right. The tentacles of the octopus are self-sustaining at the neighborhood level. And furthermore, Shakeri makes this really compelling argument that for a totalitarian regime, war operates as a strategic blessing.
Wait, war is a blessing. That's a heavy concept.
It is, but it makes sense when you look at the domestic narrative. She argues that an external war gives the regime the ultimate excuse to manufacture false nationalism.
Oh, I get it. It provides a convenient blanket justification to violently crack down on any internal dissent. They can instantly label protesters as foreign agents or spies.
Precisely. It acts as a massive distraction. If the public is focused on the threat of foreign bombs, they have less bandwidth to focus on the internal corruption or the hyperinflation.
Or the frozen meat hoarded in the local mosque.
Right. War provides a unifying narrative of survival. That explains why the regime views internal uprisings as an existential threat, while viewing external airstrikes as something they can manage and spin for propaganda.
Okay, so if foreign military pressure doesn't break the regime's grip and actually gives them a convenient cover story to tighten the screws, how does an internal resistance movement effectively fight back?
Because you're dealing with a decentralized octopus that controls both the food supply and the weapons.
Exactly. And this transitions us to the strategy of what Mr. Karegar calls the small motors of the resistance. The Kanuni Shereshi, or rebel units.
To really grasp the mechanics of these rebel units, we have to look at the political science of revolutions, specifically a concept Karegar borrows from Che Guevara.
The small motors analogy.
Yeah, so a society living under absolute total suppression is like a massive, incredibly heavy engine that has stalled. The general population is just too weighed down by fear and poverty to push start it themselves.
Right, it's just too heavy.
So you need a small, highly active, specialized motor to generate the initial momentum. And that initial spark is required to eventually start the big motor of the broader society.
And the fuel for those small motors is highly visible courage. Shakeri focuses heavily on the role of political prisoners here, citing individuals like Vahid Bani Amarian.
And his story is incredible.
It really is. These are people who are literally sitting on death row facing imminent execution. Yet instead of quietly accepting their fate, they managed to smuggle out audio messages and videos of defiance.
They use their final moments to calmly dismantle the regime's ideology for the public to see.
Yeah. And Shakeri connects this modern courage to a very specific historical parallel. She looks back to the era of the Shah, prior to the 1979 revolution.
Right, referencing famous dissidents like Mehdi Rezai and Karegar.
Because during the Shah's reign, the secret police, the Savak, were notorious for their brutality.
Unbelievably brutal. But when dissidents like Gissoo were put on trial, they didn't beg for their lives. They used the courtroom as a platform to deliver these blistering, highly publicized defenses of freedom.
And those speeches fundamentally altered the psychology of the Iranian youth at the time. Shakeri is pointing out that today's prisoners are deploying the exact same strategy.
They are consciously turning their impending executions into a torch to light the way for the next generation.
That concept of turning your life into a torch is profound. And it isn't isolated to the prisons either. It translates directly into street-level action.
Like the attack on the compound.
Exactly. The sources detail a highly coordinated operation where 250 members of these rebel units managed to attack Khamenei's personal compound. They physically broke through what the regime projects as an impenetrable iron wall of suppression.
And the logistics of pulling that off are mind-boggling when you consider the environment. The level of surveillance in that specific sector of Tehran is absolute.
You're talking about street-by-street cameras, digital monitoring, informants on every corner?
Right. For a decentralized group to communicate, organize, and execute a strike of that scale requires an incredibly sophisticated cellular structure. They have to operate in isolated, compartmentalized groups just to avoid the central digital surveillance net.
Just think about the psychological ripple effect of an operation like that for the average citizen. I mean, watching a foreign missile hit a base proves the regime has military vulnerabilities.
Sure.
But watching a small, coordinated network of your fellow ordinary citizens strike the supreme leader's compound, that shatters the domestic illusion of the regime's invincibility. It proves to the public that the octopus can actually be touched.
It fundamentally alters the baseline of fear. And this ties directly into Mr. Karegar's sociological breakdown of the conflict. He discusses the critical difference between the objective conditions and the subjective conditions required for a revolution.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the objective conditions are the structural realities. The crushing poverty, the systemic corruption, the tanking GDP, those conditions already exist. The dry wood is stacked.
But objective conditions alone don't cause a revolution, because people can suffer in poverty for decades without revolting. You need the subjective conditions.
Precisely. The subjective conditions are psychological and organizational. It's the belief that change is actually possible.
Right.
It's the trust that if you take to the streets, your neighbor will stand beside you instead of turning you in. It's the collective overcoming of paralyzing fear.
So the entire strategic purpose of the small motors, the rebel units, and the defiant prisoners is to actively engineer those subjective conditions.
Yeah.
They prove through action that resistance is viable.
It is a calculated, systematic effort to wake up the larger society.
Now, listening to this breakdown, with such a dedicated internal resistance network risking everything, it's natural to assume that the entire opposition movement is completely unified.
You would think so, yeah. You'd think everyone who hates the regime is working together.
That's right. But the source material reveals a fierce, deeply entrenched ideological battle occurring within the opposition itself.
Yeah, the political landscape of the diaspora and the broader opposition is incredibly treacherous. A major segment of the broadcast is devoted to a pointed, highly controversial critique of Reza Pahlavi.
Who is the son of the former Shah, who was overthrown in 1979, along with his political network.
Right.
And I really want to unpack this, because Shakeri and Karegar aren't just disagreeing with Pahlavi on, like, tax policy or foreign relations. They are accusing his movement of being a dangerous systemic distraction.
They go as far as suggesting his sudden surges in prominence during critical moments of uprising operate almost like an intelligence project.
Wait, seriously?
Yes. They argue that his presence actively serves the current regime by fracturing the opposition and confusing the public discourse.
Okay, so what is the basis for that?
Their critique is structural and historical. Let's look at the structural side first. Shakeri heavily criticizes a political framework referred to as Pahlavi's emergency booklet.
And she doesn't just call it a bad idea, she labels it inherently dictatorial.
Right, because the mechanics of this proposed booklet reportedly involve centralizing executive authority and suspending democratic checks and balances during a hypothetical transitional period.
Which, I mean, for activists who have spent their lives fighting a centralized dictatorship, a document proposing a new form of unchecked transitional power is a massive red flag.
Huge red flag. And then there's the historical grievance, which is equally deep. They call out Pahlavi's consistent refusal to explicitly condemn the current executions happening in Iran,
while also refusing to denounce the historical human rights abuses committed by his father's secret police, the Savak.
Exactly. To Shakeri and Karegar, you cannot credibly claim to be fighting for modern democratic freedom if you are expressing nostalgia for a previous era of violent suppression.
Karegar also points to the visual and behavioral tactics of Pahlavi's supporters to illustrate this threat. He expresses deep alarm over the formation of groups referred to as the Immortal Guards operating in European cities.
Yeah, these are organized groups of men dressed uniformly in black shirts, marching and shouting pro-monarchy nationalistic slogans.
And Karegar is very direct with his historical parallels here. He compares this behavior straight to Mussolini's black shirts in Italy in the late 1930s. He views it as the incubation of fascism within the diaspora.
And there's a massive strategic divergence regarding how security would be handled after a revolution, too. Karegar points out that the grassroots resistance relies entirely on the rebel units to dismantle the regime.
But he alleges that Pahlavi's strategy involves signaling to the regime's current enforcement arms, specifically the IRGC and the Basij, that they will be absorbed into his future government to maintain security.
And we really need to clarify what the Basij actually is for you listening. They aren't a traditional military force defending borders.
No, not at all. They're a volunteer paramilitary organization used specifically by the regime for brutal street-level suppression of civilians.
Which brings up a critical friction point. If a new leader intends to rely on the very paramilitary force that has been beating and suppressing protesters for decades, the activists view that as a betrayal of the revolution's core purpose.
Okay, I have to pause here and just play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Because if you were analyzing this from the outside, you might wonder, why would activists who are fighting a brutal, entrenched, octopus-like regime spend so much political capital and energy criticizing another prominent enemy of that regime?
Right.
Shouldn't the singular focus be getting rid of the current leadership? Isn't the enemy of my enemy, my friend?
Yeah, that is the exact pragmatic question most outside observers ask. But when you synthesize the worldview of Shakeri and Karegar, their rationale is rooted in long-term political science.
Yeah.
To them, the objective is not merely to topple the current figures in power. The objective is a structural democratic transition. And a true democratic transition requires dismantling the actual tools of oppression.
Ugh. The torture chambers, the surveillance networks, the unchecked paramilitary forces like the Basi.
Exactly. If you simply remove the current supreme leader, but hand the keys to those exact same institutions over to a new leader who hasn't thoroughly disavowed dictatorial power, you haven't achieved a revolution.
You've just facilitated a change in management.
Right. The activists fear that Pahlavi's movement, which they argue is artificially amplified by foreign media and perhaps quietly tolerated by the regime because it sows division, threatens to hijack the genuine sacrifices of the people in the streets.
They are terrified of returning the country to just a different flavor of dictatorship.
Exactly.
So if retaining the old enforcement tools just reboots the dictatorship, how do you actually build something fundamentally new? They've seen the revolution hijacked before in 1979, and they are drawing a hard line.
Right. They completely reject the current religious dictatorship, and they utterly reject the return of a monarchic dictatorship.
So what is the actual structural solution they are proposing to unite a deeply wounded country?
Well, their proposed path forward centers entirely on the concept of a national solidarity front.
And the rallying cry for this front is a slogan that's currently echoing in the protests. Death to the oppressor, whether Shah or leader.
That one sentence encapsulates their entire political philosophy. No kings, no supreme leaders. They want a total purge of the oppressors, regardless of their title.
And Karegar dives into the political theory behind how you achieve that. He explains that successful transitions from deep autocracy to stable democracy never rely on a single savior figure.
Right. They require broad foundational coalitions. And he uses some really powerful historical precedents to make his point. He looks at George Washington, who famously refused the opportunity to be crowned king after the American Revolution.
Because by stepping away from absolute power, Washington ensured the structural establishment of a republic.
Exactly. If Washington accepts the crown, the entire trajectory of the American experiment collapses into just another monarchy.
Karegar also points to Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Mandela's genius wasn't just his endurance, it was his ability to build a coalition that united incredibly disparate, historically hostile factions under a shared vision of a democratic future.
And Karegar argues that Iran requires that exact kind of institutional coalition building. The National Solidarity Front they advocate for is built on three non-negotiable pillars.
Okay, what are they?
First, the absolute structural separation of religion and state. Second, the total rejection of both monarchic and religious forms of dictatorship. And third, the establishment of a pluralistic democratic republic where diverse political parties can compete freely and fairly.
You know, it makes me think of the architecture of modern computing. What they're proposing is essentially building a new open-source operating system for the country.
Open source, I like that. Rather than relying on proprietary software owned by a single tech monopoly.
Right. They're signaling to all the different factions in Iran, look, we don't all have to agree on every single policy application that runs on this system. You can be left-wing, right-wing, conservative, liberal.
But everyone must agree on the foundational code.
Exactly. The foundational code of the operating system is no dictators, period. The code simply won't allow a single user to have absolute admin control.
That analogy perfectly tracks with the political science of democratic transitions. The critical evolutionary step for a nation moving out of autocracy is taking the actual mechanisms of power away from any single individual, whether that individual claims authority through divine right or through royal bloodline.
And permanently handing those mechanisms over to transparent, accountable institutions.
For these activists, the National Solidarity Front isn't just a political party. It's an institutional guarantee designed to prevent future tyranny.
It is a profound, incredibly complex vision for the future, built directly on the lessons of a very painful past. So what does this all mean for you as we wrap up this deep dive?
We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have. We started by dismantling the idea of the regime as a normal government, exposing it instead as a deeply entrenched logistical octopus that weaponizes basic human needs like food to enforce ideological control.
And we examined the intense, calculated psychological warfare being waged by the small motors of the rebel units, demonstrating how courage, when highly organized, can alter the subjective conditions of a society.
We navigated the fierce historical friction within the opposition itself, unpacking exactly why activists believe that handing the old tools of oppression over to a new leader is just a recipe for a hijacked revolution.
And finally, we looked at their structural blueprint for the future, a united front demanding a pluralistic republic and rejecting dictators of all stripes.
This exploration goes far beyond the politics of one specific nation. It's really a masterclass in how logistical control, historical memory, and incredible grassroots courage actually collide in the real world.
Which leaves us with a critical, lingering question based on how Ms. Shakeri categorizes the regime.
Oh, right, the ideology piece.
Yeah. She argues that this system is a completely unique, deeply embedded ideological network she defines as Akoundism. Since Akound refers to a cleric, she's describing a highly specific form of clerical fascism.
And she argues the world must study and dismantle it the exact way it had to study and dismantle Nazism.
Which raises a provocative thought for you to consider. If a regime is fundamentally a living, breathing ideology disguised as a government, can it ever truly be defeated by physical force, airstrikes, or foreign military intervention?
That's a great point.
Or does defeating an entrenched ideology require an entirely different kind of warfare? A war of subjective conditions, fought in the minds, the hearts, and the sheer organizational willpower of the very people it attempts to control.
A war where the most dangerous weapon isn't a bomb dropped from above, but the spark of a small motor igniting from below. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.